For the last few years, Apple's iPad lineup has had a large and obvious hole in it. At one end, there's the plain vanilla iPad that starts at $329. At the other, there's the impressive cutting-edge iPad Pro that starts at $799. The gap between these two devices is so pronounced that Apple is filling it with a new tablet, the $499 iPad Air. Though calling it new might be a stretch. The Air takes the same basic design as 2017's 10.5-inch iPad Pro and ushers in a handful of changes. Like the new iPad mini, it's hardly the most exciting product Apple has ever built, but it could close the gap in the iPad lineup, provided, of course, that Apple gave the Air the right mix of features. The iPad Air will feel instantly familiar to anyone who has picked up an iPad recently. It's a thin tablet that weighs about a pound, with thick bezels at the top and bottom that make room for the Touch ID-enabled home button. Just as it did with the entry-level iPad, Apple took a conservative approach to its hardware design here. But while the iPad Air isn't a futuristic device with bleeding-edge design, it gets most things right. For starters, the display is a major improvement over the basic iPad. The screen is laminated to the front of the glass, which eliminates the air gap between the glass and screen. This makes the pixels feel that much closer to your finger or Apple Pencil. It also has anti-reflective coating, a wider color gamut, and Apple's True Tone technology that adjusts the screen's color temperature based on the ambient lighting around you. Since I have True Tone on my Mac and iPhone, I'm really happy to see it here on the iPad Air. I'll turn it off when I'm editing photos, but otherwise it makes the display far more pleasant to look at. And having a laminated screen makes for a much better experience overall. Once you notice it, it's hard to unsee. These display improvements alone are almost enough reason to justify choosing the Air over the basic level iPad. The one thing missing here is Apple's ProMotion technology, which supports refresh rates up to 120 Hz. That's double regular iPads. If you want that, you'll need to shell out for the iPad Pro. But most people aren't going to miss it on the Air. Moving past the screen, the iPad Air features Apple's A12 Bionic chip, the same processor that powers the latest iPhones. While the A10 found the entry-level iPad is no slouch, having the latest processor means the Air will last that much longer. Most people aren't going to push this new iPad to its limits anytime soon, but the extra headroom should hopefully keep the Air feeling snappy for years to come. To make the iPad Air more affordable, Apple made a few other compromises compared to the iPad Pro line. Easily the biggest bummer are the speakers. The Air only has two of them, positioned at the bottom, down near the home button. Every iPad Pro model has 4 speakers, 2 on each side. This means that when you're watching video on the Air, sound only comes out of one side. The 4-speaker iPad Pro setup provides surprisingly solid audio quality, so this step back is definitely a disappointment, if not a huge surprise. Apple has reserved 4 speakers for the Pro models only, and that hasn't changed here. Apple also downgraded the back camera, but let's be honest, it's not a big deal. The 8-megapixel shooter takes decent photos, but chances are the phone in your pocket does a much better job. So just use that and avoid the inevitable judgment from your peers for using a tablet to take pictures. The iPad is still fine for document scanning and augmented reality apps, and if you really need to take a snapshot, it'll do the trick. It provides fine results if the lighting is good. The front-facing camera, meanwhile, is a big step up over the basic iPad. Its 7-megapixel sensor is good for video calls and selfies, and much better than the standard iPad's 1.2-megapixel camera. One thing Apple thankfully carried over from the old iPad Pro is the Smart Connector on the left side of the tablet, which lets you use Apple's Smart Keyboard accessory. This is a big deal for anyone who wants to do some writing with the iPad Air. Yes, you could just use a Bluetooth keyboard, but there's definitely something nice about having the keyboard built right into the cover. It's a nice small package you can take with you anywhere. It's an expensive accessory at $159, but for someone who types as much as I do, it's an essential tool. The iPad Air and its keyboard are just large enough to be comfortable and useful for extended typing sessions. Put simply, I'm really glad I can buy an iPad that works with Apple's keyboard case without having to shell out $800 or more for an iPad Pro. The iPad Air also supports the Apple Pencil, another accessory that was originally reserved only for the iPad Pro. Unfortunately, the Air uses Apple's first-generation pencil, not the fancy new magnetic model. That one only works with the latest iPad Pro. As a reminder, you have to plug in this old pencil to the lightning port on the iPad to charge it, which is just goofy as hell. And the perfectly round design means it's likely to roll right off your desk more often than you'd like. These flaws aside, it's still an excellent stylus for taking notes, drawing, or flicking through an app's interface if you don't feel like using your finger. Like all of Apple's iPads, the Air runs iOS 12, which is responsive and refined, though not necessarily the best choice for people who need to get serious work done. But the flaws we've identified when comparing iPads to traditional computers running Windows, Mac OS, or Chrome OS aren't nearly as pronounced on the Air as they were with the Pro. That's not because of any differences in the OS. The Air and the Pro run identical software. Instead, it's about price and expectations. The base iPad Air starts at $500 with 64 gigs of storage. That's a whopping $300 cheaper than the iPad Pro, and that price difference helped to readjust my expectations. The majority of people shopping for an iPad Air are probably not concerned with whether or not iOS in an iPad can replace a traditional laptop. Chances are they just want a device that's light, fast, and well built. And at this point, we know what things the iPad is best for: web browsing, sending messages and emails, watching videos and streaming music, and running whatever apps and games from the App Store you feel like trying. The iPad Air handled all of that easily, and I was also able to do plenty of real work with it as my main computer thanks to the keyboard. As with all other iPads, battery life was excellent. I got over 11 hours of screen time before needing to charge, and it'll run forthcoming iOS releases for years to come. After a week with the iPad Air, I'm convinced it's the best iPad for most people. It offers clear and significant benefits over the standard iPad, including double the storage, a much better screen, and support for the smart keyboard, while still being affordable. The iPad Pro is a stunning piece of hardware that is simply too expensive for a lot of potential buyers. The iPad Air, on the other hand, nimbly toes the line between Apple's basic tablet and the Pro lineup. If the iPad Pro is a futuristic vision of Apple's tablet, the iPad Air is the model meant for right now, with a price point and feature set that'll make almost anyone happy. It's the Goldilocks iPad, just right.